you're going to have boll weevils to continue to reproduce on that plant, not in a cotton field. So you've got to identify and destroy, all these host plants in that area. But perhaps more importantly, there's actually cotton being produced across the border in Mexico. And actually, we can eliminate the weevils or reduce the weevils there in South Texas, but in the fall of the year, some weevils may migrate back into the U.S. From that Mexican cotton. Now, ultimately, I believe we will eradicate the weevil, but we've got to get some positive work done in Mexico. And there's difficulties now in running the program in Mexico due to problems with the drug cartel. Who would have ever thought that could impact a cotton grower in Georgia? But it does. But anyway, so there has been something formed called the National Boll Weevil Protection Fund, and that's where eradication programs from across the U.S. are going to help fight the boll weevil down here in South Texas. In my opinion, the further we can fight the boll weevil from the state of Georgia, the better, because we don't want it back, because it's a very difficult insect to manage. Took multiple sprays, and we created a lot of problems when we were spraying every 3 to 4 days for boll weevils. But anyway, that's just a quick update on boll weevil eradication. We still have a big interest in boll weevils in the state of Georgia, because we want them completely rid of them from the U.S. Now, I want to spend the rest of my time speaking on thrips and management of thrips. First and foremost, thrips are our most predictable insect pest. I can assure you, if you plant cotton in the state of Georgia, the majority of time you can find thrips infesting that cotton. When we use an at-plant insecticide, we get a very consistent yield response. Probably 95% of the cotton planted in the state of Georgia, we use a commercial seed treatment to manage thrips. But a couple things of importance when we think of thrips that I think are important. Number one, protection during the first 14 days of that plant's life is extremely critical in terms of preserving yield. All right? It's extremely critical that we protect one-leaf cotton, for example. In terms of potential yield loss, one-leaf cotton is very sensitive to injury from thrips in terms of yield loss. Now, our goal is to get to the 4th leaf. Once we get to the 4-leaf stage and that cotton seedling is growing, it's rare that thrips are an economic problem. They may still ding up the leaves a little bit, but it's rare that thrips will impact yield if the plant is growing rapidly. Rapid growth, very important in terms of helping any stage of cotton tolerate thrips injury. But the main point I want you to take home today is protection very early in that seedling's life is the most important. Here you can see this little one-leaf cotton. That's a nice smooth leaf beginning to unfurl from the terminal bud. The picture on the right, you'd have to look real close, but that's a crinkled up leaf. That cotton is hammered from thrips, and I can assure you yield loss has occurred already. But again, it's just very difficult because that leaf, it really can't expand. It's just so banged up. Also, we know thrips that cultural practices such as planting date and tillage practice have a big impact on the thrips populations we expect to see. Now, this is an overhead shot of some small plot thrips trials conducted here in Tifton. And I show you this, I think it's very obvious to see the different treatments scattered out here. You can see some real weak rows, some rows that have a lot more growth. But I show you this is a conventional tilled field, and when we look at comparing thrips management practices, we'll plant the last week in April or the first week in May. That's when we expect to see our highest thrips populations. Very consistent effect. April planted cotton, cotton planted the first 10 days of May, we expect to see high thrips populations, historically. Now, 2013 was a little unusual. We had a lot of thrips on even later planted cotton. But in general, cotton planted before May 10th is where we expect to see our highest infestations. You think about your operation over the past few years, if you've planted cotton in late May or June, it's rare you ever have a thrips issue on that cotton. It's typically that first planted cotton. The other effect is tillage, and this is just some work that Dr. Taze did a couple years ago where he was comparing strip tillage and a conventional tillage system. And I want you to focus, this is 2008 data on the left and 2009 data on the right. But what he is actually showing is the number of thrips on 5 plants in a conventional tillage system or where he did strip tillage at 14 days after planting, 21 days after planting, or 28 days after planting. Now these dashed lines, that's our threshold. We have a threshold of 2 to 3 thrips per plant. But the interesting way to look at this data is if you look at conventional tillage systems in the dark on 3 sample dates in 2 years, we actually met or exceeded threshold in 5 of the 6 checks on the conventional tillage system. We just have more thrips in conventional tillage. If you have residue on the soil surface, and it does appear the more residue, the more effect on thrips, but residue on the soil surface, we just don't see as many thrips. In this strip tillage environment, he only hit threshold 2 out of the 6 checks. So again, if you wanted to think about an environment perfect for thrips, to have high thrips populations, you're going to plant early, going to use conventional tillage. And we're going to have cotton planted in that environment each and every year. But you just need to know what to expect in terms of thrips populations. Now I want to spend a little time talking about the neonicotinoid seed treatments. And again, most of our cotton planted in Georgia is going to have one of these neonic seed treatments, either thiamethoxam or imidacloprid. They're both insecticides in the same class of chemistry, this neonicotinoid class. Thiamethoxam is the insecticide component in Cruiser, also the insecticide component in Avicta. All right, that's a Syngenta product. Imidacloprid is the insecticide in Gaucho, or the insecticide component in the Eris. It's a Bayer product. All right, but they're both neonicotinoids. What we've observed in Georgia over the past many years as we've compared these different seed treatments is they perform very similar. Sometimes we see a little bit of a flip-flop, but not a lot of difference. Their performance is typically very similar. Now 2013 was a tough year for thrips in some areas, and there was actually some doubt of whether these neonic seed treatments were actually working. Well, one of the things that we don't have with the neonic seed treatment, back when we used Timic, what would sometimes happen? We'd stop up a Timic tube, right? Very obvious, right? Probably the best salesman for Timic there was a stopped up tube. Would you agree? You don't see that with a seed treatment. So we, on the farm, you really have nothing to compare with if you're struggling with just the seed treatment. But when we put out small plots like the picture I showed you earlier, we can see what it's actually doing. And I can tell you, these things do work and did work. Another important point for you to remember on these seed treatments, I don't care which one it is, but they're active. They're active for 21 days from planting. And we've got reams of data, and I can show you a pretty chart, but you just take my word for it. They have activity on thrips for 21 days. Is there value? In my mind, absolutely. Do they provide complete control in all environments? The answer is no. All right? I'm not speaking out both sides of my mouth, but it's just not, these things need supplemental treatment in some environments. Now, one thing you do need to be aware of, and if you were at Beltwide, some of you here were at Beltwide, there was a lot of discussion of this at Beltwide, but in the Mid-South, that'd be states such as Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana. Some fields in the Mid-South have shown reduced efficacy of some thrips populations for both thiamethoxam and imidacloprid. That's the 2 insecticides in our seed treatments. It does appear that feeding on the thiamethoxam products is a little more severe than it is with the imidacloprid products. Now, if you talk to my colleagues out there, basically what they're thinking is happening is they've got resistance in these thrips to these products. All right, now in Georgia, we've seen nothing to suggest that that is happening here. When I reviewed performance of how the seed treatments looked in our trials as well as Dr. Taze, they look like they've always looked. They're pretty consistent in what they've done. But you do need to be aware there may be some issues developing to our west. And this is something we're watching very closely here. Yes?
Last year there was a lot of talk about a company producing timber.
Yep.
I haven't heard anything about that this year.
That has gotten real quiet. I don't think it's going to happen. I've seen nothing to suggest to me that that product is coming in the near future. And the question was on whether aldicarb would be available as a treatment for us. Just to show is there value in these seed treatments, and again, this is a summary chart of 31 trials conducted in Georgia where we used one of the seed treatments, either the thiamethoxam group or the imidacloprid group. This shows the difference in yield where we used a seed treatment versus doing nothing. That's a slam dunk, right? It's a very consistent yield response. In the majority of cases, we see a positive yield response to using something at planting for thrips, on average over 200 pounds. So we want to use something at planting for thrips control. I actually got several pictures here, and again, this is from a trial right across the road. We actually had some Young County agents. I kept getting all these calls. These seed treatments aren't working. They aren't working. I said, yes, they are. You just don't see where there's nothing. But I sent one of my helpers over to take some pictures. The top picture is untreated cotton. You can barely see some plants here. Here's a Victa. Here's a Victa where we sprayed it with orthene at the first leaf. We always replicate stuff several times. This is Rep 2. There's the untreated, very difficult to find a plant. Here's the Avicta. Now that area of that plot was getting chewed up pretty good. And here's Avicta plus orthene. You can see we really helped it by putting the foliar spray on. Here's reps 3 and 4. Again, the untreateds are very consistent, just little twigs, not much leaf material. Here's the Avicta. You can see where we helped the Avicta with the orthene. Untreated, Avicta, Avicta plus orthene. I think the Avicta orthene in this environment really was the way to go, right? Orthene, we talk about spraying foliar thrips. Orthene is still one of our standards. It is our standard in Georgia. We can still control thrips with 0.2 of a pound of orthene, still very effective. We also can use bidrin, we can use dimethoate, and then there's some other compounds that are a little more pricey that have good activity on thrips. But we can actually achieve good control with products such as orthene. Now again, when we think about thrips, I really want you to think about damage very early in that plant's life. Again, this is the same picture I showed you earlier, but we see the first leaf coming. This is when we timed that orthene spray in the pictures I showed you earlier, right when we could see the first leaf. This is something you wouldn't see from the window of the truck. You actually have to pull some plants up, look for that damage. But in terms of yield, this is when it's happening. 1-leaf cotton, 2-leaf cotton. 2-leaf cotton is more sensitive to yield loss to thrips than 3-leaf cotton. 3-leaf's more sensitive to yield loss than 4-leaf. Every new leaf you put on there, you're that much tolerant to thrips. But this 1-leaf cotton, if you're having issues there, you just lost some yield potential. But in terms of thrips, I want you to think about when you plant a field of cotton. I've told you some things today like planting date and tillage practice that influence the numbers of thrips we expect to see, right? If we plant early, we expect real high thrips. If we use conventional tillage, we expect high thrips. Any field of cotton you plant, you could put in either a low risk category for thrips or you could put it in a high risk category for thrips. Any field of cotton you plant. And this is a summary of a bunch of trials, and I either put it in a low risk category for thrips or a high risk category for thrips. To put it in the high risk category, if it was planted prior to May 10th, conventional tillage, I expect to have a lot of thrips, and we did in those trials. Low risk was either planted after May 10th or if we used reduced tillage. We'd expect to have low thrips. Now what these bars are representing are yields for doing nothing at planting The red bar is the neonic seed treatment. So whether it's low risk or high risk for thrips, you still need to use something at planting, period. Even if you don't have many thrips, they can still ding us on yield. That's over 200 pounds where we didn't have many thrips. This is 250 pounds. So there's value in using the seed treatment. But what I really want you to understand is the value of putting a foliar spray on in this environment where we expect to have a lot of thrips. Early planted cotton and conventional tillage. Red bar is the seed treatment alone. Green bar is the seed treatment with a spray put on at the one leaf stage. That's 14 different trials we've conducted, and that's the mean difference, mean response in yield to putting a foliar spray on at the first leaf. That's about 75 pounds, I think. Not a big, huge number, but very, very consistent, highly significant. We see it almost every time. I think in those 14 trials, we increased yield 13 out of 14. I mean, it happens every time. If you're in this environment with a lot of thrips. If you're in an environment with not many thrips, there's no difference in yield. You can't really separate them statistically. So if you read our production guide, and it's going to say, unless thorough scouting reveals thrips populations are low and below threshold, a foliar systemic insecticide such as orthene should be applied at the one leaf stage in conventional tilled fields planted prior to May 10th. And what this is basically doing, if we didn't put that spray on at the first leaf, I can tell you what that second and third leaf is going to look like. It's going to be tore up. But you're going to be behind the 8 ball. So we're being proactive. It's just putting a program together. And the growers I know have done this, and the consultants and the county agents as a whole have been very pleased with this. But the data, this is extremely consistent data. I've had some calls this year about growers not wanting to use a seed treatment for thrips control. They say, well, I had to spray it anyway. I'll just do it all with foliar sprays. That's a bad idea. You can't do it. We've done trials where we have used untreated seed and started spraying at different time intervals. Let's say we sprayed it the day it came up, and in other plots we initiate treatments every 7 days. The most important time of protection for that seedling is the day it comes up. Very early in that plant's life. So it's a bad idea not to use an at-plant treatment for thrips. And again, here's that Timic tube. If you remember what it looked like when Timic tubes were stopped up, that's a big deal. Another thing we take for granted is the control of cotton aphids we get from these neonic seed treatments. We got the same thing from Timic when we used Timic. I recall looking at Timic tubes that had stopped up late in the year, and it wasn't because thrips were eating them up on June planted cotton, but it's because aphids were melting down 3 and 4 leaf cotton. So sometimes we take for granted what those products are doing. All right, I'm going to finish up just a few comments on some BT cotton. This is actually a picture we took in Plains back in 2012. Most of the cotton we plant in Georgia now are BT cotton. But I can tell you, we still have caterpillar pest, we still have corn earworms, we still have tobacco bud worms, we still have armyworms. This is just a picture of some non-BT cotton in 2012 we didn't treat. Here's some BT cotton we didn't treat on the left. We've been a little spoiled with technology, but these BT cottons are very good. But I mentioned the BT cottons for a couple reasons here. First is there's going to be a new technology commercially available in 2014. It'll be sold under the trade name of Twin Link. It's a product, a BT cotton product that was developed and will be marketed by Bayer Crop Science. So it's a 2-gene BT cotton, just like Bollgard 2 and Wide Strike. This is a little rating chart. But you can see it's a good technology. The other thing I want to mention is whether it's Bollgard, Wide Strike, or Twin Link, There's already efforts to put a third gene into those technologies. Actually, the wide strike, maybe there will be a small quantity that could be commercially available in 2014, but this third gene is really going to enhance the efficacy of these products. I mean, it's bringing a lot to the table, but the primary reason it's going to benefit us is to help with resistance management. But it's really going to enhance activity of the current BT cottons we've got. Okay, with that, are there any questions for myself on anything I've covered? If not, we're just going to go ahead and move right into Dr. Taze to visit with us. He's a research entomologist here in Tifton, and we'll just turn it over to him. There's been a few more people come in, but we do have pesticide credit sheets up here on the front row. Green is commercial, white is private. But if you would like pesticide credits, just fill these out. And I'd ask you to put them on this chair up here on the front row if you want us to process them for you.